Hey everyone, welcome back to my stream about Ars Magica Definitive Edition. This is Scott Echo of modernmythology.net, and wow. So, so far, just a very brief recap. What we've done is I did a little introduction as to the hows and whys, what we're doing, what is Ars Magica. Go check that out in part one. Part two was the basic mechanics and combat. Part three was sort of wrapping up some of those basic mechanics, encumbrance, wounds, fatigue, and recovery. So, quite honestly, that stuff I would probably say refreshingly so, is the all, you know, pretty low key. That's pretty the light stuff that we're going to be managing here. And now what we're going to do is we're really going to start getting into the nitty gritty of this game. So, just to give you a sense, we're going to be talking about covenants, and we are going to be talking covenants probably the next four videos. Yeah, so it'll be pretty clear as to why in just a moment. But basically, this is one of the most compelling parts of Ars Magica for me. Everyone talks about troop style play, right? And if you haven't checked out our modernmythology.net episode on troop style play, I'll try to put that down in the comments if I remember. Otherwise, please go check that out. But really, the covenant is what facilitates troop style play, right? The covenant is your crew in Blades in the Dark, right? Um, and it needs to be alive. It needs to come under threat. It needs to, it's the buildings. It's what it can do. It's, where it is. And of course, it's the people. So we're gonna run through first off, can you run an Ars Magica game um, with without a covenant? I mean, the answer is sure, right? My first response is I can't imagine why you'd want to, and that'll be pretty evident as we go through. I can't really imagine that it will feel like Ars Magica, quite honestly. I feel like it would just be like fancy D&D. And three, you really are shooting yourself in the foot doing so. I mean, so much of the story and mechanics of what we're going to talk about revolve around the Covenant. It's not me trying to be all gatekeeper or anything. It's just that this game can be really amazing experience with the Covenant rules. If you were to play this game without the Covenant rules, my suggestion, play Burning Wheel. I think Burning Wheel magic is going to give you a lot of the crunch and the sort of arcane feeling, but is not so centered around this troop style play and the group. It's more about your particular sorcerer. Quite honestly, I might do like a one on one or maybe even make like a solo Burning Wheel sorcerer game in the future. I'm not certain. Let's see. Yeah, if you have the inclination to play this game without covenants, what I propose is doing so a year in the covenant first, and then do a year outside. Not do going into a covenant at all, right? Just pure wilderness, maybe a year of pure wilderness, and like see what you come out of, right? But you're going to learn very quickly again how important that push pull that I talked to in part one of like this the the GM's goal here is to keep mages out of the laboratory, and the mage's goal is to stay in the laboratory. If you don't have a laboratory to go to, you miss out on this entire process. But yeah, see what the game feels like. I might even do this later on. I might even have like a year, an in-game year where I have the players out and about. And I suspect at the end of that year, they're going to come back huffing and puffing and going to be like, oh my God, thank God we're back. Right. So let's get going. So the first thing we want to talk about is the Aegis of the Hearth. The Aegis of the Hearth is a spell. Boy, is this a whopper of a topic. This spell is at the core of your covenant. It's your foundation, and the spell itself can be found on page 370. 370. Let's go take a look at it. 370. Come on. So, boop. There we go. So, Ages of the Hearth, and you will see that this is a two-page spell. This is all of that spell all the way down to here. Okay. Um, Whew, that's a lot. Could you imagine if D&D spells were 2 pages long, right? But there is, in fact, a reason for it. Now, let's throw down a little bit of lore. The ability to have magic influence over the world commonly comes from a trait that all mages have called the gift. However, this gift comes at a cost. It's sort of a biological imperative that sees people and animals alike against a magus, right? They don't trust them. They see them as strangers. They will, run the magus out of their village. The dogs will bark, so on and so forth. It's like a hereditary reaction to eons of wizards subjugating mundanes through antiquity, right? So, people are people, and people with power are still people. They're just people who can do shittier and shittier things to one another. So the commoner has developed a natural defense against the wizard. This is all sort of part of this idea that the wizard is larger than life in this game, right? Jonathan Tweet talks about it in his refrain of like these are not the other characters, right? In D&D, he points out, the wizard is just another class, right? But in this, it's the wizard and everybody else as one class, right? Or companions, and that's on purpose, right? So the gift is what sort of limits some of what the wizards can do. Now, uh, this includes other people with the gift, right? So there's a little picture of Bonasagus. We'll talk about him in a second. So wizards were commonly very distrustful of other wizards. And around the end of about the 8th century, this charming gentleman, a reclusive genius named Bonasagus, created a ritual that protected him from the magic of other wizards. Now, you could imagine that in the very beginning, this was very off-putting and grossly powerful. Like, could you imagine if you were the wizard wandering around without protection from other magic, which you weren't, no one was. But then there's one guy you cast spells on and nothing would happen. But he could cast spells on you. Well, that's the situation that Bonasagus had sort of put himself into. But luckily, Bonasagus was here to learn. That was like his big drive, was to really have this sort of big society of wizards, probably a little bit more modeled off of the cult of Mercury that was formed during Roman era. This created a safe space for wizards to better communicate and, more importantly, share knowledge. Up till now, they you had to basically steal somebody's stuff. Quite honestly, that sounds like a fucked up but great campaign. I want to use Ars Magica on some level down the line, maybe flashbacks or something like that, where you're just this wandering wizard. Maybe you have a little hut or whatever the case is, and there is no Order of Hermes, and there is no Parma Magica, and there is no covenants, and you are terrified that another wizard is going to take your stuff, and as such, as many wizards will have done, you decide to go out and hunt said wizards. Maybe you bring like a little priest friend or whatever the case is. Whew. Good campaign idea. Parma Magica is the name of the thing the Bonasagus had developed. It's a ritual learned by all hermetic magi at the conclusion of their apprenticeship, which allows them to resist magic. This is the first of Bonusagus's great discoveries. This is a special ability available only to members of Order of Hermes. So this is already developing the lore and the idea that there are other kinds of sorcerers. There are hedge wizards and so on and so forth. If you have the gift and you even could conceivably have access to spells, but you're significantly underpowered, in that you don't have this shared tradition and you don't have the Parma Magica. This is what sets you apart from wizards of other traditions, what makes the order such a force to be reckoned with in 2020, in 1220. You can generally see that in Magica, I could get rid of that soft G. An ecclesiastical Latin speaker, and I have to get used to that classical Latin. Um, Ars Magica, there are four pillars of society. There's the peasantry, the nobles, the church, and the Order of Hermes. And they really are a political force. Learning this ritual is literally the final step in your initiation to the order. They're very, very careful about that. They're like, you say all your oaths, do all of the things. We know we can trust you. Now we will teach you this thing. A cautious mage every night, every day, casts a short ritual which adds 5 times your Parma Magica score. Remember, Parma Magica is actually an ability, it's a special ability, to your magic resistance. So if a magus has a Parma Magica score of 3, in order to be successful, in order to successfully be affected by another wizard's spells, the opposing magus has to generate a total of 15 over just what's needed to make the spell work. Consider our previous conversation about ease factors and consider adding 15 to your difficulties, right? There are a number of ways you can actually increase of course, the stress die could conceivably do it, but do you want to lean into a 10 to 0.2% chance of getting numbers high enough that you can add 15 to possibly another 15, right? Remember that goes all the way to 24 plus. Now there is something called penetration, which we'll talk about when we get into spells, and the spells penetration. There's various ways you can affect penetration, and then of course anything over the spell effect can go into combating things like auras, regios, um, might of a magical creature, and magic resistance. So this made Magi with Parma Magica feel safer. And it also is a side effect of eliminating the social penalties of the gifted trait. So, you know, before when two mages met, it's sort of like in Vampire Requiem. They had this heightened sense of like predator prey kind of idea, where they when they met each other they just wanted to eat each other, right? So Parma Magica sort of removes this effect from being gifted. And we'll dive deeper into all this later, but it's important to understand that Parma Magica is the foundation of the Order of Hermes. It's sort of allowed it to, exist and thrive, and so on and so forth. All right, so, back to the Aegis. What does all this have to do with Aegis of the Hearth? Well, the Aegis of the Hearth is a covenant wide Parma Magica. It basically is a layer of magical protection for everybody within the covenant. This is no longer about Magi meeting Magi, right? This is more about let's protect our most beloved institution from other threats, right? And things like that. And this it's a spell. It lasts a year. It's traditionally cast during the winter solstice, and most covenants make a really big deal about it. Usually, they make certain everybody, all the covenant folk, make sure that they come back to the covenant for winter solstice. They make sure that all of the magi are there and that they're participating. So, what's going on with all these rules, right? 2 pages of rules for one spell. And it's about who is native or who is foreign. A covenant is a home to a number of magi, custodians, craftspeople, soldiers, and the Aegis is basically their magical security system. Natives are basically just people who are allowed access. They can come and go as they please, produce effects, magical effects within the walls. You don't want a couple of centuries of like longevity spells to wear off because your Aegis turns off the magic and now you're a shriveling husk, right? And so that's what this little system does is says who can and cannot be out and who's affected by the Aegis and who's not. So let's go over these rules. Just some simple ideas. Outside creatures with might with less than the Aegis can't get in. However, there is a little caveat to this idea, and that creature also has magic resistance, and the power of the Aegis, it's called penetration of the Aegis, has to be greater than their magic resistance. If it's not, they can ignore the Aegis. This is sort of like a really interesting intricacy here, which, seems superfluous, but you do understand that the Aegis is a spell. And so, since the Aegis is a spell, it's when we deal with like stuff like counterspell and things like that, or anti magic shell in Dungeons and Dragons, it's you're not you just generally roll for does this work. It's usually like an opposed magic roll with a DC kind of idea, and then you just move on with life. It has an effect, right? This is a case where we're saying, hey, by the way, we recognize that this is magic, and therefore anything that has magic resistance could conceivably ignore this magic. So once you sort of understand it that way, it becomes a little more understandable. And this is basically a truism for all of this stuff, but particularly for Parma Magica and for the Aegis of the Hearth, is that uh, beings that have magic resistance, the penetration of the Parma Magica or the Aegis has to be greater than the magic resistance for anything at all to happen. And then once you sort of meet that criteria, then you're looking at a creature's might. So a dragon who has a might greater than the Aegis of the Hearth rating would be able to, wander in, or a demon, or whatever, fairy, or whatever the case is. So that's critters. Outside spell effects that are less than the Aegis also cannot get in. If you throw a fireball at a covenant, your outside spell effect, that number has to get past the Aegis. But I want to point out again, if the spell effect, if the person that's doing the spell effect has magic resistance, you have to be careful that the penetration of the Aegis effect is getting past the magic resistance. So it's a weird, very weird thing. But that ultimately means, oddly enough, that Parma Magica, it's very hard to keep other magi out of your covenant, right? Because they'll come in, and yes, they're going to be affected by some of this, but they can ignore some of it because of their own Parma Magica, right? That's kind of crazy. Let's see, outside passive possession. As long as the spirit possessing somebody is passive and just basically a passenger, they can walk in. They can wander into the covenant, and even interestingly enough, they can even become they could even become a native if they're possessing somebody when a new Aegis is cast. So be very careful. Outside foreign supernatural effects within the Aegis, outside foreign supernatural within the Aegis greater than magic resistance, including Interlago. So basically, all this is saying is the same sort of stuff, is that if you're trying to cast spells, including Interlago spells, you have to get past that Aegis. You're not worried about the penetration to magic sort of thing. And that makes scrying other covenants actually pretty difficult. You have to do some things to get past it. We're going to talk about spellcasting and penetration and everything like that later on. Ultimately, all that stuff is saying that there are things called arcane foci and sympathetic foci that can actually increase penetration numbers. All right. I swear I'm almost done saying penetration. Inside foreign supernatural effects. So this is saying if, hey, somebody casts a spell in the covenant, it subtracts half the agents from the casting total. Right? So you can imagine that whatever the Aegis is in here, then that rating, then they would be removing that number from the casting total or from their penetration. And the same thing goes for creatures with might that are inside. They subtract half the Aegis from their casting total or from whatever they're doing, supernatural ability wise. They're affected just like a supernatural effect. So, all right, so we got through that, and I hope GMs have a fairly solid grasp of like what creatures and effects can and can't enter or affect the covenant. But that is only half of this two-page spell, because now we're going to talk about natives. So who are natives? First off, participants in the ritual itself, automatically natives. They do not need to be gifted to be a native to the covenant. So all those coven folk, that's why they have them in, and that why they have them participate in the ritual. Are they saying the words, or do they doing various things? To some degree, but most importantly, they're there. They're sort of supplying their will, and we'll talk about how rituals work and such like that. Any mage that happens to be in it is called a participating mage and or magi. And the participating magi actually have a number of things that they can do. Anybody, they're not only natives, they also have a couple other things that they can accomplish. First off, they can invite others. During this ritual, a number of tokens can be enchanted where you can hand out these tokens to somebody. And this is actually a big part of the ritual of people coming, right? And most people will understand this, or at least, especially magical people, will understand that, I'm coming into your home, you invite, you vet them, or whatever the case is, and you're probably during some sort of meal, or whatever the case is, you're presented with a token that makes you a native. Why do you do that? I mean, you don't do that for everybody, but you're certainly going to do that with anybody who's going to help you with spells in your lab. You're certainly going to help anybody who's helping you do various things, or if you want them to be able to use their powers to scry, to get you information about somebody else, things like that. They need to be a native so that their own magic doesn't shut down. It's pretty rude to have somebody's sustainable effects get shut down by the Aegis. And in the very beginning, early on, that's probably okay, but and that stuff comes right back up once they get through. But but yeah, it's you don't want their positive passive magics to be basically struggling in here to keep them alive or astute or whatever the case is. Participating magi can revoke anybody anytime, even if they're mistaken about the target's identity. Uh, if you know who the person was when you thought about it, the spell knows who you're talking about, and obviously partially because you've given them this token, right? And even if they do not know the target was invited, you kind of can guess. You kind of like can look and be like, "What are you doing here? You're not invited," and they're not invited anymore. If they weren't invited, it doesn't matter. They're not invited either, right? So it ends up being like that whole the idiom of if you stab someone in the heart with a stake, because if they're a vampire, they die, and if they're human, they die. It's the same sort of thing. Uh, Participants that were actually in the ritual itself cannot be uninvited. This is only for people that Magi have given a token to. But all the coven folk and such, you can't just kick them out. You have to recast the Aegis. Items created by or used by a native or present when the Aegis was cast are native, right? So if a native uses or creates an item, then it works within the Aegis of the Hearth, within the Covenant, or if it was present when the Aegis was cast, it becomes native. And when we're talking about sentient things, obviously they are more like creatures that have might or magic resistance and stuff like that. These are non-sentient items, and so on and so forth. So I could kind of see the two story elements to all this. One is to complain how an antagonist could sneak in, do some damage, and create some fun, like, oh, you gave Dobby a sock moments in the PC's Covenant, right? I don't think that this is something that you lean on often, which is a little frustrating because, quite honestly, as with many of the rules we'll talk about, there's probably a lot of rules that aren't going to be engaged with. Although it's probably behooves if you've learned this right now that you've seen, once you've learned this, it probably makes sense that you go through and use this to some degree, right? Maybe have a group that understands how the Aegis of the Hearth works, and thus is working hard to work against it. Maybe a spy, a non-magical spy, has sort of come in to try to leave some sort of corruptive element or an arcane focus or something to that effect, or somehow tried to be able to have something that destabilizes the Aegis of the Hearth. Secondly, having these rules creates an interesting path for players to take when infiltrating an NPC covenant, right? Despite the fact that the Parma Magica makes everybody, hunky dory with one another that are gifted, that doesn't mean people aren't assholes, right? It doesn't mean that I'm sure you're going to have lots and lots and lots of conflicts with other covenants and other magi. Um, I wouldn't want to see too much time spent planning these capers. I like to take much more of a blades approach to these sorts of things. Sorry, you're going to do this, but it probably would behoove good players to sit down and understand these rules if they're planning on doing something like that. To like engage that the 2 pages and be like, okay, here's what my numbers are going into this, right? And I think that's really important for the players to also take some agency, um, because that really, you're not flipping through the book, although I suspect there's going to be some of this during this game if you play this game, but you're not flipping through the book and like slowing down the narrative. And not relying necessarily on just the GM to understand what all of those rules are. Um, I say that fully realizing that I am doing this process. I am reading this book cover to cover and all of the various other source material so that I do know this stuff, so that I don't have to look it up. But that is just the process of casting the spell, right? Uh, this is about characters arranging things to try and get around the ages could be pretty compelling. Storytelling could be fun, particularly understanding how challenging it is for foreigners to affect natives. So you have a revenge plot against the Magi, very powerful drive, and then say, okay, but in order to get my confidence, I have to kill this guy or set this guy up or whatever the case is. You get like a little, Maggie uh, Mission Impossible thing going on. And I think that could be a pretty fun game. Also, it informs the fiction and ritual and token systems where we need to include this idea in like hospitality rituals. Now, when I say hospitality rituals, I don't mean magical rituals. I mean, hey, by the way, we should do these things. And we should expect these things to be done. When we go into another person's place, we want to make certain that it doesn't get missed and that we have to worry about the consequences of, oh, I noticed you didn't give me a token. Is that, did they do that on purpose? Did they, do that in error? And you have these conversations. Thinking about this, it is interesting to be reflecting on Burning Wheel instincts and how vital instincts are to this process of like informing the fiction, because you don't want to kind of come out of that immersion for the players to be talking to one another and being like, oh, and did you notice they didn't give us a token? And be like, Jim, be like, oh, no, 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 they did. We just didn't go through that, process. And maybe a little ritual needs to be formed, or a little sense of like instincts of like, okay, this happens unless I say it doesn't happen, right? Kind of idea. You go through it 2 or 3 times. You say, by the way, from now on, this is going to happen. This is going to be the ritual, especially places you've gone to in the past, you know. So, all right. Well, that's some heady stuff, right? So now let's get into covenant concepts and seasons. But understand that the Ages of the Hearth is sort of this cornerstone of how you start every covenant. Now, uh, this idea of seasons could be a little confusing considering how heavily seasons fit into the flow of the game. Um, but we look at covenants as also having seasons. Let's see if I can find that page again. Whoop. Um, and the idea here of having them be, what's this? Here we go. There we go. The idea here of having them have seasons is um, is to get a sense of like where they are in their own journeys, in their own processes. So we have technically five. We have spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but then spring again, right? So how this works is spring covenant is just starting out. This is like a frontier feel of a game. This would be like a fun. Okay, we've set up tents. You know, we have our shovels. Um, Now what do we do? We're roughing it. You know, um, summer is established covenants in the prime. By the way, one of the fun things about spring covenants is that all of the players are probably like the movers and shakers within the covenant. You know, there's not older magi to boss people around. Some are established covenants in their prime. They're still growing. This is focused on like growth and politics. Summer covenants, if you're going to have a summer covenant saga, this is these are like the movers and shakers in the Magi, in the Order of Hermes, and you're very likely to have a lot more traffic, people coming and going, probably ones that you're not really keeping track of. Some of the other ones, like spring and winter, everybody knows everybody. If you see somebody strange, you know, you you're gonna know it. In a summer covenant and probably autumn to some degree, but especially summer, there's gonna be people coming and going, and you have to understand ways to keep track of some of that stuff. This also very likely means, and from now on, that you're going to have younger magi who are in some sort of hierarchy with the older magi, and it's up to the troop as to who gets to play whom, whether or not there are some GM only NPCs or if everybody is up for grabs. Um, We'll talk about that in just a second. Autumn is past their prime but vibrant. This is sort of focused on conservation. This is focused on look, we've done our thing, we've shot our shot, we've made our mark on the world. Now we're trying to stay relevant. We're maintaining our Weiss. We're maintaining we're trying to maintain our membership, that people aren't wandering off and going to summer covenants or starting their own, right? There's this is a transitionary period, where a lot of the older magi are just trying to hold on to what they've got. This is another very outward focused kind of covenant. This one is where summer people are coming to the summer covenant. Autumn people are going out and bringing stuff back, right? Winter covenants seriously in decline. This is a bunch of old fools in their laboratories. These places are blasted out from, you know, various mishaps. They have all sorts of magical creatures wandering around. These can be pretty chaotic and depressing. The magi may not be in control of their own faculties and so on and so forth. This style of play is like playing new blood amidst decay. Very often you'll play sort of new, upcoming magi who are sent to these places to maybe inject some life into them, maybe learn from these magi or get them out of twilight, or to maybe they go here in tutelage to learn something, or maybe they're sent here as a punishment, right? So, a couple really fun ideas for this. And then spring is so there's another really strong concept which is second spring. And this is a covenant that is in ruins. It's past its winter, and needs rehabilitation. What I like to refer to as like winter reborn. And this is very much like a spring covenant. However, this is about uncovering lost secrets. This is about, instead of being in a wilderness, you're in a ruin and you're trying to uncover the varying layers of what might continue to exist within this ruin. What wonders and horrors can you unseat? Pretty cool stuff. There's also a strong sense that new players probably have a better time playing less experienced magi, and sort of grow into the magic system. You're just starting with a couple spells. You're just starting with a few arts and techniques, and you're then going to learn more and learn, how the player is going to learn as the character learns. And so you can, I would suspect most sagas you're probably going to have be focusing on these younger magi. Now, more and more experienced players could lead the way with older magi. But remember, the interesting background premise of this is this idea that the GM is taking magi out of the laboratory, and the magi are trying to stay in the laboratory. And what's interesting here is that you definitely get this sort of, quasi exploitation where older magi are basically making certain that there's older magi here so that they don't have to leave their laboratories, right? That the younger magi go out into the world and do all of that shit while they get to, hoard power. And you could definitely see a very interesting social dynamic in some of these older season covenants. Um, and there's a laudable attempt here creating some ready to play scenarios for both covenants to be taken whole cloth or and be cannibalized for their parts. Something for the players to engage with. And there's also a sample covenant for each of the 5 seasons, including Winter Reborn. So, for those of you who are tired of listening to me talk, who don't want to wade through some of this stuff, for maybe your first season, maybe or your first year rather, maybe a new group starts out with one of these starter covenants. They're really very good, honestly. So Vernus, this is the covenant. Vernus is a spring covenant just starting out in the world. At the moment, the covenant consists of a number of tents pitched around a standing stone and a clearing. The of Aestus is a summer covenant. Medium power has become the mundane lord to the local village. That's pretty interesting. You're really engaged with the locals. Covenant itself is a large castle. The fortifications are not up to date as they might be. So that's pretty cool. This one is kind of cool because the Magi have chosen one of their number with a gentle gift to serve as liaison with the outside world. Autumnus is a powerful autumn covenant, a powerful covenant with an autumn power. I don't know why they. Okay. Oh, autumn power is a thing. Page 177. The physical structure of a single enormous building covering a whole of a mountain peak to keep warm and habitable by magic. The entrance to the buildings are protected with magic as well as solid mundane doors, and the need to climb the mountain first makes a serious attack very difficult indeed. So that's pretty cool. And then Heims is a winter covenant. It's a medium power. It's winter ruins. The covenant is now only 6 magi, whereas once it had over a dozen, and the number of covenant folk has shrunk to an even greater factor. So you could see that this is I love just the evocative nature of the seasons, right? Of like a covenant in winter, you know. And I think you could play with that really well. There's also some pre-made covenant situations. I don't necessarily think it's important to go through them, but basically, what this does is, and we're going to see this over and over again. So, just like we had the sample covenants in their various conceptual seasons, now we're starting to get into the mechanics, and you can see how here's that thing, the autumn power that it was talking about, and you can see that it's using some hooks and boons, which is its own separate video, where it just takes a number of ideas and concepts, what it can and cannot do, and just starts you off. Right, which I think is pretty cool. Mundane Lord, powerful location, struggling, urban, or winter ruins. So these definitely lean into using those internal situations. Um, then we go to page 178. So 178 takes it to the next level, right? We've what we've done is we've said, hey, we have some starter covenants, whole cloth. All right, great. We have, excuse me, we have a number of hooks and boons. Great. Now let's let's just pick up, do some of the slack, right, and say, hey, what are the starting things you need for a covenant? And not have a lot of this bookkeeping to do. Is this a weak covenant? Is it a medium covenant? Is it a powerful covenant? Some of that can be determined by the seasons, but not necessarily. Like you could have, it's pretty obvious that like an autumnal covenant is probably pretty powerful. A summer covenant could be more up and coming or powerful. A winter one could be dilapidated but still have all of this stuff, right? Or it's been picked clean and it's a winter covenant with that's weak. So this is just a good sense of how to just start off without diving into the nitty gritty. Again, I would probably suggest people new to Ars Magica definitely take this route. You can always move your saga to a new covenant. Heck, you could always burn your covenant to the ground, and now you have to start from the ground up, and they make that. I would probably steer away from powerful covenants, quite honestly. I think these make for good NPC covenants, but but then again, powerful covenants, draw powerful attention. All right, so, and, you know, even if you decide to go the completely customized route, my suggestion would be familiar with these, right? Be familiar with how many of each things there are in this, right? So, all right, well, we're going to have a weak covenant. What does that look like? What have they done? They did all of this math for you. Um, what does this mean? Now you just go in and say, what are the spells? What are the abilities that are looked in? What's the source of Whis look like? All right. So then we're gonna roll up our sleeves and get into sort of nitty gritty of Covenant Convention. I love this stuff. And I have to sort of remember that the player's covenant is something that you should all build together, and it's not just the GM's domain. But that doesn't stop you from creating other area covenants or those that they may play in a future saga. That doesn't stop you from maybe starting a covenant that some of the players come from and are they going to go to a new covenant. That traveling between covenants is a really good introduction to characters. It should not take more than a session. It should not really take probably more than an hour of a session, quite honestly. Just really jump right in. But yeah, it could be a solid way to introduce characters, have some strong scene framing. Now, so let's get into it. First, on page 179, you have a baseline. This this baseline is a stone building with enough room to accommodate the Magi and their coven folk. It's got a level 3 magic aura, which we'll talk about later. It doesn't have any magical resources, but it's sufficient mundane resources to ensure that Magi do not have to worry about day to day upkeep. Um, and it's a fortified structure with a few people in it. Assuming 4 magi, there's likely about 12 additional inhabitants, and that level 3 magic aura to start. Then the next step, so you have this baseline. Then the next step is to understand what your power level is going to be. Now, this is a little different from what we saw with power level in the sample weak, medium, and powerful. That was just saying this is a covenant stats that do those things. This is where you're actually going to build. Now, so the group decides on a power level where their covenant is in the power curve, while the season is conceptual. This is sort of more concrete, right? It establishes how many build points you have, which we'll talk about in a second, the max level of any text in the library. So a low level, your max level of text will be 25 and 40, and then you get into no limits. And also, how much history is there? What's your minimum age? So a medium covenant's open for 10 years. What does that mean? What was happening 10 years ago, right? As compared to, say, higher legendary covenants that are 50 and 100 years old or more. These are just the minimums, right? This here also sort of allows for the idea that these are just minimums. So you could have a 1,000-year old covenant or several 100-year old covenant that's at a low power level. Um, so, yeah. Um, all right. Let's see here. So the covenant seems to be built on three separate pools of points that you need to be. We've looked a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about build points here. You're going to have hook and boon points, which we're going to talk about in another video, and then pounds when we talk about finances. Yes, finances. Yes, pounds. Pounds as in the British pound. The British pound is sort of like a short form for currency. It's just what they use for mythic currency just to make it easier. Um, Now, these three things can be a little bit confusing because they're often referred to as points and things like that. So you just have to be paying attention to where you are in the text. And we're going to go over each separately. Now, the next piece of the equation is all that goes into this, right? So build points. First and foremost, you have these resources, and these resources If I went over all of the details on these, this would be a 4 hour video. I don't think anybody wants that from us. So we're going to be making some solid decisions about our covenants by understanding this stuff. Like I'm going to go back and read these. I am going to make videos on each of these pieces: long-term events, labs, and hermetic magic. But suffice it to say, if you want to, your players should have probably a pretty solid idea here what's going on. Now, I want to point out this is sort of a critical piece because libraries are very, very important to that push pull. And you want players to really be pretty comfortable with what's down there. Um, I am going to be, I mentioned it later on, I am going to be creating maybe I'll share it, a Python script that creates some sample libraries where you can basically plug in your build points and your power levels and stuff like that, and it will generate a library and a lab texts for you. Um, Part of what I like doing and is fun to me is including the lore to each of those things. Like what is the name of this book and what to do and who wrote it, and how, most importantly, how does that inform the story going forward. So this is really fun, powerful stuff that you can have fun with, and some of this can be generated by the GM, some of this, but you have to be really careful here because what books you choose for the library, your art sumai and your ability sumai and your tractatus, this is going to determine what they can do here. So some of that you actually want to leave open to the players. Sometimes there's a little bit of discovery. I go into the library and see what they have. But by and large, you should probably have a spreadsheet that has all of these texts. And you should probably have the ability to keep track of all of these texts. I'll have to look at the Ars Magica manager to see if it allows you to do that. I haven't looked that deeply in yet. Um, Lab texts are, again, we're going to have videos that are covering a lot of this stuff, but this is just the build points. Lab texts are ostensibly spells that you can learn. They're formulas, right? Sometimes they're formulas for spells, sometimes they're recipes for crafting items, that kind of stuff. And then casting tablets, these are like D&D scrolls, right? These are tablets that you could pull out. They're probably in stone or something crazy, that people can cast spells off of. We're going to talk about later on. We are sources of quintessence. Um, these are bits of raw magic that various things can produce, and this is like some of the fun stuff. And we're going to talk about we later, but this is some of the fun stuff that like you see in Invisible Sun, where it's like oh, the memory of a child being hugged by his mother, and that produces weem, that kind of deal. So these are in your area, and it's sort of like another one of these cornerstones, right? A library is important, but sources of weem are very important. Which we're going to talk about why later on. So, having this little bubbling brook that has a special quality to it, or having this tree that produces these particular apples, that are small but sweet, or having a cave that, whispers secrets. And you could collect the dew that drops off of the ceiling. These are all things that not only are sources of power, but also sources of like, okay, How far is this from our magical regio? And do do we want to work towards incorporating it? Where do we get these? Do we have to go outside our Aegis of the Hearth to acquire our Weem? Our is it do we have to do another one? Like there's a lot of like cool pieces of this equation. And enchanted items, you can start with a number of enchanted items that can help usually in laboratory work. I see this as like a sim game where those games where you start to build a dungeon and then you like slowly but surely add more rooms that attracts different things and has it's possible that this could be actually a really fun concept for a saga, right? Is a building saga. You start with the baseline, fuck everything else. You know, you your your Magi are you're going to spend a year going out and what books have you brought to our new covenant, right? How powerful is that? If you want to be part of this covenant, let's bring on a book and let's get on this idea of how did you get books out of libraries of other covenants? What have you written yourself, but what have you stolen away? And what happens if they find out? Gosh, that's some good stuff. Yeah, fresh dew on the grass, the quiet bustle of morning chores, a world full of potential. Grab a hammer and get to it, right? This is the spring covenant idea. So the thing is, we start with this library. These mages are academics, right? This is for these wizards. They are definitely academics. Books are critical to their research and advancement. The bottom of 179 and 180 summarizes all of this stuff pretty well. I'm not going to go over in terms of what these build points are: two per five levels, one per five levels. We are going to do a sample covenant at the end of this sort of chapter as a video, so some of that might be a little more transparent. I hate not going through this more thoroughly, but sort of in service of brevity, just keep an eye out for my future videos about all of these things, right? And yes, it is pronounced Weiss, pronounced Weiss. All right. Let's see here. Next is specialists and teachers. Specialists and teachers. So teachers, actually, I'm just going to go to the next page here because it's all right here. Teachers are determined by their communication, teaching, and high ability score. Their score limits are by age. This is actually pretty interesting because this is one of those situations where we see how this game is like rules nested in rules nested in rules, because in reality you really should have these small at least NPC stat blocks for all of these people. This is not Burning Wheel where you're circling these people up on a moment's notice. We really should have. I'm going to have a stable of these people. I'm going to whether I create a script that's just going to sort of belt them out for me, or I actually come up with, little motivations and backgrounds to each of these people, and and so on and so forth. I haven't decided yet, but I'm definitely going to know when they approach a person. That's a lot of prep. And I will say a lot of these other books that Atlas has produced, you can really cobble together a lot of that. In fact, I'm wondering there's got to be we'll look at Project Red Cap, but there's got to be like an NPC database out there somewhere. And if not, maybe I should create one. But this game has been around for a long time. I would be shocked if that didn't exist. And if it does, If it does exist, please, by all means, like drop me a link in the comments. Um, all right. So that is going to be all for today. Tomorrow, I'm going to continue on by going through hooks and boons. And then we're going to talk about covenant folk and then covenant finances. Woohoo, accounting. Oh God, what have I agreed to? But yes, once, so that right there is 4 videos, including creating a sample covenant, and then 4 more videos, which these are like bigger conversations in terms of laboratory and long-term events, um, that just help inform creating the covenant. I'm probably going to do all of these first, and then I'll go back and do videos for the other pieces. So that's just a piece that I'm going to look at ahead of time, but I may not make the video ahead of time. I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. This is quite a journey of discovery, and I really appreciate you being here and casting the spell with me.